Well, how about that? It's looking like it's about to be blown wide open. And it looks like Norris almost blew his brakes. But yes, ultimately, McLaren were winners here. Sure, the team didn't look quite as imperial as people had dreaded, but they were ultimately the most successful this weekend. And whilst Norris still leads the championship, his teammate has made some headway by cutting the deficit toward his teammate by half. It's now 10 points instead of 23. And ultimately, they finished with their 50th 1-2 in the team's entire history. And I am so happy to say that it was my boy who came out in front. Fantastic. And it proves that both drivers are absolutely on it. But that being said, Lando had a little bit less of an easy ride to getting second place on the road in the race because, the sprint wasn't that amazing. And in the race, he had Russell and Stroll to contend with, mugging him of his second position on the road, so that means he did lose a little bit of time. And then not to mention, he lost 2 further seconds to Piastri on the road, thanks to Albon once again channeling his inner Kubica. I would like to just say, with a little bit of a foam of doubt, that in their own little ways, these are very, very subtle. Both drivers were trying to assert themselves with the team that they are the ones who should be given priority. And again, these are very, very small things, but this could add up over the course of the season should things get incredibly close, especially since now Piastri's back in the hunt for the championship. Because there was something I was noticing with Lando's ongoing brake issue that, admittedly, it was getting worse and worse and worse over time. Russell was within a second and a half at the end of the race, and I do feel like Norris wasn't helping the matter because he was told by a team instruction to back off with it, be careful with the brakes, don't make it worse because they were going rather long. And despite that, Lando was still closing in on Piastri, getting under 3 seconds before then ultimately finishing almost 10 seconds behind come lap 56. But at the same time, Piastri wasn't doing his part in trying to break away from Norris to give him air, which is cleaner, because 2.5 seconds, it's a fair distance away, but it's still enough to muddy up the air just a little bit. So you could easily point to both drivers and say, hey, I saw what you were doing there. You're trying to fight for domination in this team. Cheeky, cheeky. So for any Lando fans out there, no, I am not egging on your boy solely. I think Piastri was being cheeky as well. But having said that, I would say that Lando's mistake probably might have been more costly had the race been a lap longer or the brake issue had been 1 lap earlier. I know, ifs, balls, dad, etc. But still, I would say that Norris's plight was a bit more precarious than Piastri's. But either way, doesn't really matter. They both got a 1-2. McLaren extended their lead in the constructors, job done. What more does there need to be said? And even though you might be a bit confused as to why I put Ferrari here given what happened on Sunday,
especially since by the time you watch this video and as I've been editing this video, both Ferraris could be or have been disqualified. Charles Leclerc being 1 kilogram underweight and Lewis's skid wear and being a bit too much. So for anyone coming from Mercedes to Ferrari, welcome to Ferrari. Just hear me out on all of the other stuff apart from this, okay?
As a whole, the weekend was a much more solid affair when compared to Melbourne, where it was absolutely disastrous, with Lewis rebounding solidly from the first round with a pole-to-win sprint session, and Ferrari bringing both cars home with a good clutch of points. Because considering at the moment Red Bull's only got 1 car that is scoring any points at all, and Mercedes are gathering points of their own, because remember, Russell's got consecutive podiums now. We'll talk more about Mercedes in a bit, but this was the kind of weekend that the team needed to realise that, hey, maybe that first weekend was a bit of a dud. Sure, it wasn't ideal for giving Hamilton his dream debut, but I am happy to say that he did respond, and Charles Leclerc woke up, as I was speculating in my sprint review video yesterday. I'm glad that he decided to get out of bed and show who was boss, even if it did ultimately mean that, yes, both Hamilton and Leclerc did make contact on the road, albeit accidentally. And you might be arguing that really Ferrari should be in the meh section, but that win for Lewis was absolutely vital for his confidence. But I do think that this weekend shows that there is a little bit more work to be done with the communication department between the pit wall and their new driver. And also, Il Predestinato, their mainstay, was then humbled in the sprint. That's not exactly ideal. So both drivers have got something stuck in their craw. They both want to prove something and ultimately become the Ferrari #1, which is absolutely customary. And in the words of Valtteri Bottas, traditions. It's a good thing that Leclerc's pace wasn't too badly compromised by that contact, which again might have been accidental, but it still happened. And it does make you wonder what his pace might have been like had his wing been in full mint condition. Maybe he might have been much closer to Russell, he might have even got on the podium and really stamped down, woken up against Lewis, and then the situation, the quagmire, would have been even starker, considering especially Lewis then had his own situations. The pit stop strategy didn't work out for him because he did the 2-stop, whereas everyone else at the front did 1, so he finished 6th when he really should have been a close 5th, or maybe just still duking it out with Verstappen, so that's not exactly doing much favour there. But then also the radio communications were still quite feisty. Lewis was pushing back, and sure, it may have been harmless right now, it didn't come to blows, but it is very much Hamilton stamping down why Ferrari chose him and to justify the salary he comes with, as well as the prestige. Because he ultimately said, when being told to ultimately make the swap, "I'll tell you when we make the swap," and he did it in turn 1 instead of turn 14. You might be arguing, what does it matter, Law? He made the swap, he followed through on the instructions given, but it's still very much the language. He is very much trying to keep a lid on it and acting politely and respectfully, but also assertively. But this is something that we do need to keep a check on throughout the entire season. That team orders are coming around here, the swapping positions, the reticence to do so. It's something just to observe. I'm not making a final judgment right now, there is still more to be done, and as I said, communications still need to be thrashed out. But in the scope of the entire weekend, this was a much better time of it, with Ferrari making up the issues that they had in the first race, and then getting back in the hunt for the constructors. Especially since, again, Red Bull are on the back foot. Well, they've only got 1 foot at this point. Charles has now responded to all the stuff from the sprint and then the first race, and then Lewis, he is now calmly starting to really turn the screw on the pit wall. What comes next remains to be seen. And then another podium for George with a front row start to boot, almost catching out Piastri in said start and run into turn 1 with a faster getaway. Yeah, I know, it's not exactly fighting for victories or anything, but 2 podiums in a row, and with George looking more confident than I have ever seen him, this is a really strong show for Mercedes, and they can easily now say Auf Wiedersehen to all the stuff that they were having to deal with at the start of the last 2 seasons. This is much better. Much more like it. And with Antonelli, he did his job as well. I was a bit surprised that he got driver of the day, considering there were other drivers who also had a really good day of it. But nevertheless, he still came away with 6 points throughout the entire weekend. He still clings on to the championship top 5, which for a rookie is still incredibly impressive, which is something to be said here. But for Russell, oh my goodness. Sure, he is getting up to many shenanigans off the track with all of the stuff he is saying about McLaren and what have you, but the fact remains is that this is so much more of what Toto expected from George and Kimi. There is very little justification to get rid of either driver, so I wouldn't be at all surprised that based on the results we've seen so far, with Mercedes still second place in the Constructors, a potential announcement of an extension for both Antonelli and Russell will be forthcoming in the next few races. I am pretty sure of it, that the whole thing with Max Verstappen, it's no longer an issue, even though Zak Brown is constantly trying to reinforce it, and Toto not seeing anything on the matter. The one caught in the middle between Horner and Brown's little spat. And again, you might find it weird that I'm putting Racing Bulls in the winners list, despite Yuki's weekend ultimately being compromised by a 2-stop solution which didn't work, like Hamilton's, and then his front wing bizarrely failing under load. The team should still be quite pleased with itself for the way both its rookies carried themselves over the weekend. Because this winner's accolade is solely dedicated to both Isaac Hadjar and Yuki Tsunoda. And for the Hadjar fans out there, I do have to formally apologise for my relative dismissiveness this time last year about Isaac's prospects in Formula 1. He has proven everybody wrong, including myself, and I'll hold my hand up here. As somebody who makes content for YouTube and the Formula 1 community, it is very important to show aspects of humility, and in this case, I am more than happy to say this, that Isaac is doing the business. The boy done good, and he continues to do so. I mean, both drivers getting into Q3, Hadjar out-qualifying Tsunoda, albeit mistakes from Yuki, that is still a really strong bounce back from all the stuff that happened last week. Fantastic stuff. But still, the strategies did get in the way and has cost the team valuable points. Points that could have been theirs and meant they should easily be in double figures, whereas instead, they only have 3 points to their name. It is not a true reflection on the potential of this car. They really need to get a little bit of a wriggle on when it comes to the midfield battle. There is hope to be had here, but there's very much stuff that needs to be done when it comes to, well, pit stops and maybe even just general integrity of their front wings. And as for Haas, my goodness, what a way to bounce back, eh? Because the last few weeks have just been nothing short of absolute ridicule. All of the stuff through pre-season testing, the decision to focus solely on race runs and barely having any time for qualifying, which ultimately didn't do much favours for Oliver Behrman's stock, that's all completely turned around. The justification in a fully dry weekend has truly paid off. Sure, they were relatively nowhere when it came to sprint qualifying and then qualifying itself, but over the course of the race, they come away with a double points finish, and with Esteban Ocon looking truly on it, and the fact that Alpine were nowhere, them being nobbled far more than Haas, because Haas were caught in the crosshairs of the FIA's flexi wing adjustments. Alpine, no points. Ocon comes home 7th. And I will say, that overtake Esteban did, he had balls going that deep onto the grass. And as for Oliver, well, I think Oliver's got a little bit of a catchphrase brewing here with his "shall" remarks. What a way to make up for last time out, what with his situations in practice. Yeah, he may have missed out on getting more points, but the overtakes we saw from Behrman were incredibly feisty. He mastered that hairpin after the very long straight, humbling Alpine in his own way. Now, you may be thinking I'm showing British bias here, but the fact remains is that Oliver is now doing the business as one of the really interesting rookies. Sure, Haas was struggling a little bit with the top speed in the course of the overall race, but it didn't really matter because they've come away now with 7 points and have closed the gap to Williams in the battle for now 5th place in the Constructors. This is much more like it. I am pretty sure that Ayo Komatsu is looking really pleased with his lot right now, the strategy of theirs finally bearing fruit. If they can keep this up and really produce consistent results, and they could maybe have a chance to match their 2018 finish of 5th in the Constructors. Sure, it's early days right now, and things could easily change again once we get to Suzuka, but this is much more like it, and it just goes to show Haas is back in the mix, which for us is brilliant. More competitiveness, more competitors. Not to mention for the fact that Oliver Behrman had never raced at this track, and I will touch upon Oliver later on in the video for obvious reasons. And speaking of midfield prospects, we now start off the section with Williams. Sure, their new guy Carlos isn't setting the world alight in ways that people would have hoped, but it has had a positive influence in spurring Alex Albon right when the world was starting to ask questions about him, with a 2nd consecutive points finish, this time in P9. And I will hold my hand up as well. I was a little bit skeptical about Alex going into the season and in the winter break, but the fact remains is that he has well and truly responded. And maybe his good form and fortune might be then spurring on a prospect of a Thai Grand Prix in the next few years, which to me would be a really good boost for his overall confidence, especially since this is right now the closest he has to a home race. And what justifies Williams being here as well is that Racing Bulls did not capitalise on their qualifying results, and it meant that Williams managed to pull away from them further, and even though Haas are now back in the game as well, they at least managed to make some damage limitation by able to just push away that little bit more, so that means Haas are now just not 1 point behind them. There's 3 points between them now. And also, Williams are now in double figures, which is far better prospect than they were in last year. Even though I have been gushing about Carlos the last few months, I am more than happy to give criticism where it's due, as well as credit where it's due. The fact remains is that Carlos has still got some work to do when it comes to handling the car, because there have been some very unpredictable moments, and also it does go some way to maybe justifying how good maybe Franco Colapinto truly is, because in his second race he was able to get a P8 right behind Albon. Maybe the prospects of Franco in the future may be really rosy, and in the long run, Williams will stand to benefit, because at the end of that Alpine contract, if Franco wants to come back to Williams, if they are in a really good position, then James has got a really good and now more experienced driver to then fill in the gap for Sainz or Albon in the future. And even if not, if it doesn't work out for Alpine, they don't utilise him, Williams can bring him back, and he will have still gained and benefited from Alpine's testing programme, much like with Oscar Piastri at McLaren. But mainly about the fact is, Sainz does need to get a wriggle on now. There are some question marks starting to form whether the hype is justified or not. And I am more than happy to take the L if it ultimately doesn't pay out right now. But there is a reason why I call it an arc. We are at the perilous twist of Act 1, as it were. And then the other person in the mess section is Lance Stroll. Points weren't forthcoming for Lance, but he was doing stuff, and for him, that is more than enough to warrant credit. He kept Norris behind him in the sprint for a good long while, and he managed to give Aston Martin a snifter of hope with that long first stint working as expected, maybe showing the car had some potential after all. Should they be able to develop it further? Should Newey cast his beady eye on it when they get to Imola to make sure they don't have that traditional fall off in pace and then they're nowhere? If that doesn't happen and they actually end up with a good, consistent, solid program, then maybe there might be hope yet for Aston Martin. And Lance Stroll, so far, is the guy who is doing the business for Aston Martin. Stroll has brought the car home twice, whereas Fernando hasn't. And I know that might pain some of you out there, but that is reality. Points would have been better, but for Lance, this is something. And this is the first time I have done this for a while, but Red Bull, you are not just a loser, you deserve, with me using the spanner to point you in that direction, are destined for the dark pit. Yes, Max's lack of impact is one thing, but Oliver Behrman passing Liam Lawson on the same compound is testimony of what it means to actually support your second or rookie driver. At this point, I have no sympathy for the team itself, as the current situation it finds itself in is of their own making. And just as I am recording this video, I have seen notifications saying that there is going to be an emergency meeting about the situation going on with Red Bull Racing. And I, for one, will be saying this is far too early. Liam Lawson needs to turn up to Suzuka and then prove himself there, since Super Formula is basically living in the backyard of Suzuka. If he can't perform then maybe you could have that meeting. But for now, Yuki Tsunoda, he's doing his own thing, and still justifying why I put Racing Bulls in the winners section and why not in the losers section, since, well, they lost out in the race due to their strategy not working out, and Yuki Tsunoda's front wing putting pay to any hopes of trying and salvaging a single point. And yes, it is up to Liam to try and make use of what he has got. But the reality is becoming more and more obvious that the team is setting Lawson up for failure by trying to placate Verstappen, and also the contractual shenanigans I mentioned in my video from yesterday. And the only thing that is saving Red Bull from a total disaster is that Max has been relatively reserved about the search for a solution for the RB21's lack of versatility when it comes to the setup and balance. But how long will that last, seeing now podiums are looking less and less certain? This weekend has been a total and complete embarrassment for the Red Bull Racing organisation. Even if Max Verstappen was able to drag that car into 4th place, getting one over both Ferraris when Leclerc looked like he might have gotten 4th place, it was touch and go there. Max did the business, Liam didn't do the business, and many of the other drivers, including even Jack Doohan, although penalties put pay to that on the actual classifications, got past him. That is a major, major problem, that second seat, no one should touch that with a barge pole. Maybe Carlos Sainz dodged a bullet there. Sure, Williams is not looking hot right now, but at least there's a long game going on there, whereas Red Bull, what is the game? And it doesn't help that Max inadvertently wasn't helping out his teammate by commenting that maybe he might do better at Racing Bulls since that car may be easier to drive. I am not jumping on Max saying that was in any way, shape or form an insult. He was trying to just say straight, honest facts, that the RB21 is incredibly difficult to drive and may not be suitable for a rookie. So in a way, Verstappen may be criticising the decision to put Liam in the car in his own way, straight talking, blunt. But it may be misconstrued by the wider media. They may be saying, Max wants Liam out! Blah, 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 blah. No. I'm putting the spanner in on that one. And again, both Racing Bull drivers were humbling the second Red Bull seat by doing their own thing. And then Ted Kravitz was eviscerating Christian Horner on live TV, talking about paying off Checo and the like, him turning the screw further than an interview I recalled that Lee McKenzie and Bernie Collins did with Christian Horner around Spa 2024, where Horner got incredibly defensive and, not necessarily verbatim, was basically just going, well, what would you do then? He got really, really shirty at that moment. So in comparison, it's not nearly as spicy, but Christian was on the back foot there. This entire situation is maybe showing that Helmut Marko might have lost his edge, because when was the last time a Red Bull Junior has actually made any sort of headway in getting some progress or what have you? And I understand that some of you may be sick or tired of me covering Red Bull in such a negative light on this channel, but I can't help it if they keep dragging themselves back into headlines for making these kind of decisions or having such a really horrible time when it comes to their public relations department. That's on them, not me. I'm just reporting the news. But hey, at least Max Verstappen is being relatively chill about it. Imagine if he was actually going all guns blazing, because on the radio, we barely heard anything when GP was talking to him. Maybe he was trying to not give the FIA any sort of ammunition to try and punish him again. But either way, Max was keeping silent. He is probably staying out of this. And unfortunately, Sauber were back on form by staying out of any relevant competition. Sure, Bortoleto had a spin of his own, but ultimately, not even the P12 for Nico in qualifying was enough to make up for the performance just not being there where it mattered, which we hoped had been resolved back in Melbourne. And when it came to the overall battle between both Saubers, because ultimately that's what it was reduced to, Gabriel still came back from that spin and managed to make good and overtake Nico, and getting a really good solid gap between them, which is, in that battle between those drivers, a really hopeful sign that Bortoleto does have potential and you really should be paying attention to him, and that is why he is one of my boys, even though Oscar is my main boy. So that all can be said, really, because there was not really much else to say about that team, unfortunately. And then for Fernando, this wasn't the best of weekends for him, especially at a track that he quite likes. A brake issue curtailed any hopes of maybe scoring a point for the team, and it means that Lance has now finished both races, and now Alonso has had 2 consecutive retirements. It's not ideal right at the time when Adrian Newey has arrived and you're really trying to justify yourself for a long-term position and maybe starting to rebound, the hopes of maybe win number 33. It's not the best of starts for Fernando, and again, this track is one that he really likes, but maybe Suzuka could produce better results with the time to refocus. Maybe a couple of upgrades might come in for the team. And Fernando is pretty handy at Suzuka as well, so there's some hope still going on. But if Lance once again finishes ahead of him next time out, then, you know, I'm pretty sure we might start seeing on YouTube is Alonso washed sort of videos. I'm holding firm right now. I'm keeping steady, but this isn't ideal for him. And it isn't ideal for Jack Doohan, because this section was going to be about Alpine in general, but I had to lift Gasly out of this because he was just doing his thing and kept relatively anonymous. But I do have to acknowledge that Alpine, with this FlexiWing saga change, they have been clearly nobbled the most. However, Jack's weekend was absolutely scruffy. Sure, you might be thinking, well, surely Liam Lawson's lot was worse than this, but at least he didn't rack up any penalties. There was that scare when he was noted for something with Behrman in the sprint, but then that was completely absolved. But no, over the course of the weekend, Jack had 2 time penalties attached to his name. A 10-second penalty for his altercation with Bortoleto, then there was 10 seconds in the race for making contact and pushing Hadjar off the track, and then he narrowly escaped a 3rd penalty, being noted for other means of just moving around the track unnecessarily. It was incredibly messy. And even though Alpine have been starting to actually admit that maybe some of their noise on Franco has contributed to all of the rumours about Doohan spiralling to the point where it's completely untamable, this is going to be more and more evidence for Flavio to write in his notebook and justify why he should get rid of Jack, because he's incredibly scruffy. In this point where the midfield is incredibly tight, they need both drivers to be as close as possible, that maybe the decision to replace Doohan with Colapinto may happen sooner than expected. This is not great for Jack. I feel for him really badly, but you got to admit, this was really rough. I applaud him for being tenacious and giving it a try, but it ultimately didn't work out in his favour with these penalties. Losing positions in this manner is not ideal when you've got that kind of person overseeing the entire team. But Liam's plight is still something worth discussing, and I'm pretty sure there'll be more news to come in the next few days, but it is, and while he has to own some responsibility for the situation he finds himself in with little good grace with the fandom, Red Bull have been caught with their figurative pants down. To find out more about this, if you haven't already watched this video, because there have been many people curious on the matter, watch this video next, straight after this one.